Hey everybody, Medium Brandon Ross. Thanks so much for tuning in on More Than a Medium Media Network. You can check us out. Don't forget to click like and subscribe and all that other good stuff. I know that I've taken a little bit of time off for my own channel over at Medium T Brandon, but this is one to make sure I dust myself off and make sure I get in here. Ozzy Osbourne, in case you haven't heard already, has passed away at 76, just 8 days after his legendary farewell concert, literally a farewell concert. Um, it was comprised of many of the musicians in his wake, excuse the pun there, of his music career. People that he played with over the years, being able to bury the hatchet, come in, work with him for one last time. It was no longer about your beefs. It was actually about celebrating the man, the music, and everything else. He's known as the Prince of Darkness. He's known as the Godfather of heavy metal. He is somebody that is super important, not only to the genre, but also music as a whole. Let's not forget a little bit of a backdrop for him. I'm going to be super quick onto the description of him. Bear with me for just a second. Of course, he was one of the founding members of Black Sabbath, 1968. They came out with 3 seminal albums, self-titled Black Sabbath, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, and Sabotage. All 3 of them were incredibly well received. You had the likes of Iron Man. You had just one classic after another from that genre. And by the way, if you've ever been in a band, and I don't care what instrument it is that you play, I do not care if you were in a Tijuana brass band, you learned how to play Iron Man. It's a thing. Like, you have to. It does not matter what you do, what instrument you played, you will end up learning parts of his catalog. In 1979, he was kicked out because, of course, of his drug and alcohol issues, which is kind of interesting. When you get kicked out of a heavy metal band for your drug and alcohol, it means you truly kind of have a problem. And by the way, his tattoos were kind of an early warning signal. We'll just go ahead and say that. But then he moved on to some serious greatness. He got hooked up with a classical guitarist who was actually in a band called Quiet Riot. Yes, that Quiet Riot. Come on, Feel the Noise. Had nothing to do with this great man, though. Randy Rhodes, who passed away in an airplane accident. And of course, to the right here is his wife, Sharon, who actually really helped him through his struggles with alcohol. And there's something to be said for this. And when I get to his astrology, I want you to pay attention to why people would still stick it out with Ozzy. And even if you had a beef with him, you would kind of move on. Well, of course, when Randy passed away, this really made him plummet. And of course, he had constant fights with record companies. He was biting the head off of, doves and bats. I mean, there's 400 stories around that. And of course, urinating at the Alamo. Not a lot of good looks, if you will, if you're coming to terms with somebody that might be in the limelight. But he's a rock star, so you kind of take it with a grain of salt. But underneath it all was a severe alcoholic. He was abusing his body on a level that was not consistent with anyone's, long-term goals, so to speak, right? So moving forward, I mean, he kind of did this really kind of interesting kind of makeover of himself in the early 80s when he stepped out onto his own. And then after Randy passed away, the search for the guitarist were legendary. He actually he had told George Lynch that he had the gig, and then George came in and had cut his hair and all of this other stuff. And sure enough, George gets kicked out of the band before he even gets in there. Brad Gillis was his guitarist for the last part of the tour, filling in when Randy had passed away. The life of the party was kind of, drained from him. And then then the search was on, and they found this really great guitarist by the name of Jakey Lee, who he's been amazing. He was an amazing godsend. Actually, all of Ozzy Osbourne's guitarists, his 4 primary guitarists, Tommy Iommi, rewrote the book on how, rock guitar was played with drop-down detuning. He had the finger, all of that stuff. Randy Rhodes taking a classical approach to the music. Jakey Lee on the unabashed ruling of the blues chords that he would present that made everything heavier. And then, of course, Jakey Lee, or then, of course, Zakk Wylde, rather, in that later into the 90s. So he had some really prominent guitar players, which is part of the reason why Ozzy's legend was so great. Now, behind the scenes, after he kind of quasi-retired, he moved on to his public image all over again. This is when he put out a very refined album where Mama, I'm Coming Home, If I Close My Eyes Forever came out. And this really kind of set him onto mainstay radio. You know, it was something very kind of friendly. It was ballady. It was whatever. It was so that then he could, you know, do the other songs like Ultimate Sin and so forth and so on. But he had kind of refined himself. And it was during this kind of late 2000, 2008, 2009, I can't quite remember the years, where the Osbournes came into effect, which was a really kind of interesting thing because during this time, you know, television wasn't doing reality shows like this. I mean, they were doing some kind of like, they were doing the house stuff on MTV, but that was kind of like, that wasn't working with anyone that was famous. Well, Meet the Osbournes really kind of launched not only Ozzy's second part of his career, but also Sharon's career. That's part of the reason why Sharon's been on all of the women talk shows, The View, and all that other good stuff, and how she kind of got a reputation for kind of being well-spoken, outspoken, and kind of, you know, hardened in her ways, no matter what her business acumen is. And, you know, you can ask Bob Daisy, who was Ozzy's bass player during Blizzard of Oz time. He basically wrote those songs with Jakey Lee and then got virtually none of the credit, which, again, this is actually something that comes up in his astrology when we pay attention to it. Really didn't care for Sharon, because Sharon was a staunch advocate to make sure that he was going to be provided for. And then, of course, his last kind of hurrah here, I think it was, let's see, if I'm counting down the days, it was the Saturday, I think it was the 12th. And then here we are passing on the 22nd. I mean, 10 days later, he's passing away. So that's a pretty, I mean, listen, and he did okay. I mean, he definitely sounded like he was 76 years old. And, you know, you can't really necessarily knock him for missing notes or whatever the case may be. That wasn't the reason why we were doing it, you know, why he was doing it. It was really to kind of celebrate him. Sharon, being the master promoter that she was, watched a lot of people bury the axe beforehand. And, you know, people like Jakey Lee, who hadn't actually been on stage for 30 years with Ozzy. Zach, who had kind of been in and out. And I think he always had a good relationship with Zach, but Zach, like, listen, I got to do my own thing, man. And Ozzy's like, I am the thing. And, you know, Sean, you know, all of that stuff. But with that in mind, that final concert represented something that I think we can all learn from. And nobody regrets being a part of that show. Nobody regrets burying the hatchet, you know, putting aside bygones to be bygones, like, oh, I got 2 percentage points when I should have gotten 3, and blah, 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 and all that other stuff. Now, that doesn't excuse Sharon for being kind of a dipwad about some of the business dealings. However, at the end of the day, when you're able to honor somebody who, by the way, made a lot, I mean, you would not know who Zakk Wylde is. You would not know who Jakey Lee is. You would not know Randy Rhodes. Quite frankly, Randy Rhodes was ready to quit his local band, you know, to, you know, their unknown LA band, to go teach classical music. That's literally what he was planning on doing when he got a phone call and somebody said, could you fill in for Ozzy? He's looking for somebody new. And he said, well, I don't even really know any Black Sabbath songs. And they said, well, he wants all new stuff. And he goes, I'll show up. And he came in and he played what later became Giants. And Ozzy's like, you're my guitarist now. And he said, well, I don't really know if I want the gig. What do you want me to pay you? And he says, $2,000 a week. He goes, fine. You know, Randy Rhodes did not know that $2,000 a week was nothing compared to what he was making, but whatever. You watch the evolution of a man and his music. And when you see that he was part of the revolution of what rock and heavy metal was becoming through Black Sabbath, through his next steps with Randy Rhodes, through all of his ingenuity, and then to watch him kind of reinvent himself on you know, on real-time TV, you know, in this reality TV, he is literally part of the reason why Donald Trump is successful. If you want to go there, I can't go a video without mentioning him. But, you know, this is the Venn of the two of them. And what's interesting about Ozzy too, and I just want to point out a few things into the astrology here. I'm going to actually reduce myself a little bit more here to make sure that this gets a little bit bigger. I don't know his exact time of death, but the planet placements are going to be pretty close because, of course, as we know, the natal chart is what gets acted upon this. There are two things right here that I think are really kind of transcending. You always want to pay attention to what's happening in the 12th house and the 8th house. So a couple of things that are here. So regardless of what this time is, if we find out that it was noon or whatever the deal is, these are only going to advance just a little bit, with the nodes kind of working backwards a little bit. In the 12th house, this is interesting. And probably arguably 10 days ago, his Vesta was matched up in conjunction here. Guys, this is somebody learning their lessons about the unknown and about their faith. And by the way, having that conjunct to Juno, against his rising, one way or the other. And again, if you're a few minutes off, it's still up against his rising. That it's conjunct with Venus. And I was always outspoken with how much I thought, the thing that you don't realize about Ozzy when you're all entertained with him is how much of a chauvinistic asshole he was to Sharon. Like, he was abusive to her, like flat out, even on the TV show. Like, somebody edited this and still couldn't make him look. That's as good as they could make him look. So maybe this is him applying those lessons, right? And in his natal chart, having his sun be in Sagittarius, he's December 3rd, 1948. And it's interesting because there are a lot of placements here that I've been analyzing that were very similar to my mother's. And some of you, and by the way, thank you again for all the well wishes. Yeah, I've been taking some time off. Leave it to Ozzy to get me out of retirement a little bit. I'm not really retiring, but having to take some time off. But there are two things that are going to affect what's going on right here. And one of them, in Ozzy's case, is where Pluto is. Pluto being opposite the sun. This is when vitality kind of loses out and an odd sort of empowerment comes in. We're just a few days away from Leo season. He's also his first house having the sun, Mercury, and then Chiron in Sagittarius really speaks to a wild man becoming tamed. He was destined to be that, guys. He was destined to be a wild man. Sagittarius, very much like you got a wild hair up your ass to go and do whatever it is you want to do. Well, this is what makes you bite heads off of bats and doves and all that other good stuff, right? And his communication style might be a little brash, might be a little whatever, but he's destined to kind of have it. And having Chiron there and having Lilith just move over Chiron, guess what? Or at least approaching it, just becoming conjunct. That's a conversation for healing those wounds and identifying with those, right? In his second house, having Jupiter conjunct to Mars, conjunct to the moon in the second house in Capricorn, that means that he is going to be a bit of a breadwinner. So although the reincarnates of Black Sabbath with Dio were actually better songs, we can get into that debate another time. More influential was Ozzy. Better written songs were, Neon Nights and that sort of thing. But his ability to be a cash cow for people is sitting here in the second house. First of all, having his Mars in Capricorn, that's a workhorse placement. With Jupiter, he was a workaholic. So that's also going to not play well with somebody that might have addiction issues. See also his first house. And having his moon and just being like, I'm sorry if I hurt you, but I have to keep doing this. That is a key thing. Now, there is some irony having nothing in his third house, having a void third house, but having Pluto work through that right now really kind of speaks to the last concert that he did. Okay. And then interesting into his fourth house, which rules family, which rules kind of the sullenness of like what's closest to you and what you consider family. The North Node is transiting through that. And you have the conjunct of Saturn and Neptune in Aries, has its own hardships with it. But this is kind of him taking a look at like, this is what family is. I did this. I did it my way. I did it unusually. And I took it to heart. Now, Having Lilith and Juno in conjunct here in two different signs in his fourth house, that's kind of his tale of two cities. He had a divorce early on in his life. Sharon were on again, off again. Neither one of them were faithful to each other for decades, but it worked for them. Sometimes it just works, everybody. Chiron in Aries. Boy, how long has Chiron been in Aries? Good Lord, forever and a day. Thank you so much. Chiron returns 3 years ago. Having his north and south node, this is kind of interesting. I think this kind of, signifies him that his north node was Taurus. This kind of means that he kind of had a compass. Whether you liked it or not, he had a compass. And his value system was about putting himself first. See, also, that's the way it goes, right? Now, in the seventh house being void, this also means that he might have been networked, but he didn't have a lot of friends. And I'm going to reference the 11th house here with Neptune and Libra there, which means that he's going to have unusual relationships. He was not easy to know as a person. You might have respected him. You might have appreciated him for who he was, but he didn't have any best friends. Maybe Sharon, because she stuck it out with him, but there we are. Now, here is a key component. You have the moon transiting over his natal Uranus in the 8th house. By the way, having Uranus in the 8th house means that you're going to have a penchant for the macabre. You're going to have a penchant for the dark side of things, right? Because Uranus being the trickster and the 8th house being that of death and, kind of, I'm just going to say the underbelly of the world, and having Venus kind of just broach inside of this, and Uranus just being empowered by the Jupiter transit just a few weeks ago. The 8th house, I think everybody knew the end was near for him, but this was definitely an activated point. I do also want to point out, this is interesting, that when you talk about things being activated in someone's chart, you have Uranus here that is squared to Mars. You also have it squared to Saturn and Neptune, for that matter. So you kind of have this very kind of public death. You have this public outpour. It affects the family and what's grounded. See also the concert. And then you have the moon being in opposition to his sun, right? Moving through this and kind of saying and having Venus opposite the sun right here. My gosh, this is a reconciliation of shit that wasn't nice. Sorry. Right. And I know that it's on this cusper here of Venus to the sun definitely counts. I mean, it's certainly a wide angle, but that transit was going on. The moon just transited, over the opposite of his moon, which means it would have been a full moon. See also your bark at the moon jokes. Just having fun. And then, of course, the sun moving into the 9th house, just moving out of the 8th house, meaning that it's a transitional time. Having Mercury conjunct to Pluto, it had just gone retrograde over Pluto. That is a sign of death, everybody. In the 9th house, it means long-term travel. It also means lessons learned. Saturn sitting here in his 9th house means that he was always going to learn as it goes, even if it's tough lessons. Sun to the Virgo placement is a little bit tough, even though the Saturn is connected to the Earth sign of Capricorn. It's also tough to kind of translate. And then, of course, back up here to the 10th house, the very kind of public south side of this. Of course, he died being on stage, guys. Let's just cut to the chase. He died being on stage. 10 days ago, he had a concert, a sold-out concert. All of his friends showed up. Everything really kind of flowed for him. And again, I don't care how he sounded. No critique on that crap. Just, at 76 years old, you're going to sound that way. And having just lost my 76-year-old mother, I'm telling you, the 76-year-olds are feeling this right now, these placements. They are absolutely feeling these placements. So this transition isn't over yet. The 76-year-olds are probably in a little bit of transition time. It's just, it has to do with initial placements, primarily things of Saturn to Uranus. So your Saturns are going to come in either late Leo early Virgo. And during this time, it is squared to Uranus. That's part of the reason why it acts. The Mercury retrograde, along with the Mars placement going through Virgo, it's a tough placement, everybody, especially here with the South Node, because you just can't get comfortable. The South Node means for you to be comfortable, but unless you're agitating. So honestly, Ozzy felt really good about doing this concert because he was in a natural state of turn it up, Sean. That's my Ozzy impression, by the way. All right, guys. Thanks so much for hearing me out. Thanks so much for being part of this. It felt good to do it. I needed to do something like this to get myself out of my own stuff. Thanks, guys, for being part of my journey. Heart taps. The studio is open. Keep going. Be sure to like and subscribe to everything that we're doing here. Be sure to catch the new podcast, which will be premiering early April during the Lionsgate. Extra optimistic on all of your, podcast platforms. Keep going.